Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that's pretty complex and controversial, I guess you could say, and that is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, or, as it's more commonly known, AFSPA from 1958.
Right.
So for those of you who know a little bit about this already, we're not going to spend too much time on like the real basic, what is AFSPA? We really want to dive deep into this. And we have a ton of great material to work from. We have the actual act itself and a really in-depth report from Amnesty International.
Yes.
So I'm excited to hear your thoughts on all this material. So I guess just to start off broadly, can you talk a little bit about like the origins of AFSPA? Where did this thing come from?
Well, it's really interesting. The roots actually go back to British colonial rule.
Oh, wow.
And it was originally enacted as a way to suppress armed political movements in Northeast India. So you can already see, given that historical context, there's a lot of baggage that comes with this act.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really important point. Like, this isn't something that, was just recently invented. This has been around for a while, and it was born out of a very specific context.
Yeah.
Which, as you said, brings up a lot of questions about, how relevant it is today.
Exactly, and how it's evolved over time.
Right.
And I think that evolution has really been marked by this constant tension between the need for security and the potential for human rights violations.
Yeah.
And I think that tension is what sits at the core of a lot of the debates around AFSPA.
Gotcha. So I guess to kind of start unpacking that a little bit.
Sure.
One of the key things that people talk about with AFSP is this idea of a disturbed area.
Right.
Right. So it's not just any area where there's, some unrest or something.
Yeah.
There's a specific criteria that has to be met for an area to be declared a disturbed area, right?
Right. And the criteria are fairly broad.
Okay.
Which is part of the problem.
Okay.
The act itself doesn't really clearly define what constitutes a disturbed area. Instead, it gives the power to declare an area disturbed to the central government, a state's governor, or a union territory's administrator.
So it's a pretty top-down process.
Very much so.
Yeah. And a lot of critics of AFSPA have said that, this process lacks transparency and is prone to misuse.
Exactly, because that vagueness of, what is a disturbed area really raises a lot of concerns about accountability.
Right.
Who decides on what basis and what are the checks and balances?
Right.
Those are the questions that are really fueling a lot of the debates.
Yeah, and it's not just a historical thing. I mean, this is something that's still happening.
Very much so.
As recently as October of this year, 2024, parts of Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh had their disturbed area designation extended.
Exactly. So it's an ongoing debate.
Yeah, very much so.
It's very relevant.
Which makes it even more important to understand, what exactly are the powers that are being granted under AFSPA? Because it's not just about saying, okay, well, we need to maintain order. It's about saying we're giving the armed forces these extraordinary powers.
Right. And indeed, the act grants them the authority to, quote, fire upon or otherwise use force even to the causing of death.
Wow.
When individuals are suspected of breaking laws or disobeying orders in these disturbed areas.
I mean, that's pretty alarming, right? To say that, someone can use lethal force just based on suspicion, even if it's in a disturbed area, that really opens the door for a lot of potential problems.
It does, and that's why, organizations like Amnesty International have really argued that provision violates international human rights standards, particularly the right to life and due process.
And it's not even just the power to use lethal force. We're also talking about the power to arrest without a warrant. Search without a warrant.
Yeah, strongly.
Destroy structures.
Yeah.
I mean, these are some pretty extreme powers. And, as a result, there have been accusations of, widespread human rights abuses.
That's right. And Amnesty's report really goes into detail, documenting numerous cases of alleged extrajudicial executions and forced disappearances, torture, rape.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that these aren't just statistics. We're talking about real people.
Absolutely.
Real lives that have been devastated by violence and the abuse of power.
Yes, it's heartbreaking. And that's why, understanding this is so important.
Right.
It's about moving beyond, abstract legal discussions and really grappling with the human cost of this law.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think we've laid a really good foundation here.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot more to unpack. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into the legal challenges to AFSPA and talk about, what are the complexities of trying to balance security concerns with human rights.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned.
So with all these concerns about AFSPA, have there ever been, like, legal challenges to it?
Oh, yeah. There have been some pretty significant ones, actually.
Okay.
In fact, the Supreme Court itself has actually weighed in on AFSPA a few times.
Oh, wow.
Back in 1997, they actually upheld the constitutionality of AFSPA. But they did stress the need for safeguards and thorough investigations into any alleged abuses.
Right.
So even though the highest court in the land said, yeah, this is constitutional, there are still these big questions about, can it actually be implemented in a way that respects human rights?
Exactly. And this kind of gets to the heart of the dilemma surrounding AFSPA, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have these security forces operating in incredibly challenging environments, facing real threats. They need legal protection to carry out their duties.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you have this law that by its very nature grants these extraordinary powers that can be misused.
So it's like the very law that's supposed to be protecting people could also be used to harm them.
Exactly. It's a really difficult balance.
Yeah.
And it's made even more complex by the fact that we don't really have comprehensive data on the full extent of human rights violations that have occurred under AFSPA.
So we need data to figure out how bad the problem is.
Yeah.
But the law itself makes it hard to get that data.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a bit of a catch-22. And that's because the very nature of AFSPA, with its restrictions on legal proceedings against armed forces personnel, makes it really difficult to document and investigate these allegations.
Right. It creates this cycle of impunity.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this reminds me of Section 6 of the Act, which requires prior permission from the central government to even begin legal proceedings against armed forces personnel for crimes committed under AFSPA.
Wow. So you can't even start an investigation without the government's permission.
Yeah, essentially.
Wow, that seems like a huge obstacle to justice.
It is, and it's been a major point of criticism from human rights groups like Amnesty International.
Right.
They say that it just fosters this climate of impunity, and it makes it almost impossible to hold perpetrators accountable.
And Amnesty goes even further than that. They state that AFSPA violates what they call non-derogable provisions of international human rights law.
Non-derogable?
Yeah, these are rights that are considered absolute. You can't suspend them even in times of emergency. So they're talking about things like the right to life, freedom from arbitrary detention, the right to a fair trial.
So it sounds like we're dealing with this clash between these two kind of irreconcilable positions, right? You have on one hand the argument that AFSPA is necessary to maintain security in these volatile regions.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have this claim that it fundamentally undermines basic human rights.
Exactly. That's the tension.
Yeah.
And that tension has fueled ongoing debates about, what are the potential solutions?
So what are those solutions? What are people talking about?
Well, there are two main paths that people are advocating for.
Okay.
One is to repeal AFSPA altogether.
Just get rid of it.
Get rid of it. They're arguing that it's inherently flawed, it's incompatible with democratic values.
Okay.
And then the other path is to reform AFSPA.
So tweak it, change it.
Exactly. Try to fix it.
So let's dive into each of those options a little bit more and kind of explore the arguments for and against them.
Okay. Sounds good.
We've been talking about this debate around AFSPA, this real tension between security and human rights.
Mm-hmm.
But I think sometimes the best way to really understand the impact of a law like this is to actually hear the stories of the people who've been directly affected by it.
Absolutely. The human stories behind the legal debates are what make it real.
Right.
Amnesty International's report does a great job at this.
Yeah.
By highlighting, individual cases.
Yeah. One that really stood out to me was the case of Manorama Devi.
Yes, Manorama Devi's case from Manipur is really tragic.
Yeah.
It's emblematic of the concern surrounding AFSPA.
Right.
In 2004, she was allegedly raped and murdered by members of the Assam Rifles.
Yeah, and it's a horrific story. And the fact that, her alleged killers were never brought to justice,
right,
it just really underscores this sense of impunity that surrounds AFSPA a lot of the time.
Absolutely. The lack of accountability in cases like this just fuels the perception that AFSPA creates a shield for security forces, making it really hard to address these allegations.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just, I can't imagine the pain and suffering that her family must have gone through.
Right.
Knowing that the people who were responsible for her death might never be held accountable.
And unfortunately, Manorama Devi's case is not unique.
Right.
Amnesty International's report details numerous other cases of alleged extrajudicial killings, disappearances, torture,
Yeah.
in areas where AFSPA is in force.
And each one of these is a life that's been shattered
Mm-hmm.
and a family that's left, grappling with this immense loss and trauma.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that we're not talking about abstract legal concepts.
Right.
We're talking about real people, real lives that have been irrevocably changed by this.
Yeah. So it really brings it home that this isn't just, some theoretical debate.
Yeah.
This is about real people
Exactly.
who are being impacted by this law. So I guess the question is, where do we go from here? What are the paths forward?
Well, we've been talking about repealing it or reforming it.
Right, right. So let's kind of unpack those a little bit more. What are the arguments for and against each of those options?
So those who advocate for repealing AFSPA say that it's just fundamentally flawed, that it can't be reconciled with democratic principles and international human rights standards.
So they're saying the law itself is the problem.
The law itself is the problem. You can't reform it enough to fix it.
Wow.
They point to other countries who have faced similar security challenges.
Okay.
And they say, look, they've been able to manage those challenges without resorting to these types of laws.
But wouldn't that create kind of a security vacuum?
That's a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Those who are advocating for repeal, they say, yeah, we still need security measures, but it's about finding alternative approaches that prioritize human rights.
So what would those look like?
So things like empowering local law enforcement,
Okay.
investing in intelligence gathering, focusing on conflict resolution and peace-building initiatives.
So it's really kind of a holistic approach.
It is a very different approach.
Yeah. And I imagine that would require a lot of political will to actually get something like that done.
It would be very challenging.
Yeah. But a lot of folks say that that's really the only way to address the root problems with AFSPA. Now, what about the reform option? What are some of the specific changes that people are proposing?
So those who advocate for reform, they say, no, we can salvage this.
Okay.
We can amend it to address some of the human rights concerns, but still provide the security forces with the tools they need.
Okay.
So they talk about narrowing the definition of disturbed area, making sure it's only applied in very specific situations.
Okay.
And for a limited amount of time.
So you can't just have this indefinite disturbed area designation.
Exactly. And then they also talk about increasing the oversight of military operations in these areas, making it easier to hold perpetrators accountable, and establishing independent mechanisms for investigating complaints.
So really addressing those core criticisms of AFSPA. The lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, the difficulty in prosecuting, alleged perpetrators.
Exactly. Trying to strike that balance.
So, this has been a really heavy topic.
It has.
An incredibly important one. I think we've really, unpacked a lot here. The history, the powers, the controversies surrounding AFSPA. We've talked about the arguments for and against it. And, most importantly, I think we've heard the stories of the people whose lives have been impacted.
Absolutely.
And I think our listeners are walking away with, a much deeper understanding of this complex issue. But this is not where the conversation ends.
No, it's just the beginning.
Right. This is something that we all need to, continue engaging with, stay informed, and really advocate for solutions that uphold both security and human rights.
And remember, this is not just some abstract legal issue.
Right.
It's a human issue.
Yeah.
And it's one that deserves our attention.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thank you for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for listening. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.